Did you know that the map of Europe as we know it today, with its borders, countries, and spheres of influence, was, for the most part, scribbled together by 5 white men in a golden hall in Vienna, back in 1815? We're about to uncover how the Congress of Vienna tried to erase the chaos left by Napoleon using gold ink, stiff jackets, and good intentions, or, let's be honest, convenient ones. The idea was simple: restore order, put kings back on their thrones, and keep the status quo intact. But in the process, those diplomats didn't just redraw borders, they redefined what conflict, repression, and instability would look like for the next 100 years. And stick around until the end, because we're going to see how everything those men ignored, silenced, or suppressed came roaring back with a vengeance: revolutions, nationalism, and civil wars, proving how a peace treaty can also be the opening chapter of a long, messy disaster. And yes, those choices still echo in our world today. Now, imagine the vibe across Europe right after Napoleon's fall: exhausted armies, ruined cities, toppled thrones, and people with revolutionary ideas bubbling in their heads. The promise was, let's rebuild peace. But what really happened looked more like a boardroom of ultra-rich shareholders arguing over how to split the spoils of a collapsed empire, each one tugging at the map, preaching justice while quietly doing the math on their own profits. France, the defeated one, got a seat back at the table. Poland turned into a shiny ornament for the Russian Tsar. Italy and Germany shattered into pieces like fine china no one wanted to glue back together. It was like using a ruler and compass to paint over cracks in a house that was already falling apart. And at the center of it all, a hall in Vienna, filled with champagne, self-important diplomats, and an impossible mission: to create eternal peace on a continent that had only ever known war. Let's talk about that shiny new map they drew. When the Congress of Vienna sat down to redesign Europe, they weren't thinking about people. They were thinking about borders, stability, balance, ego. It was like a Civilization 6 late-game map. Turn 250, diplomacy on hard mode, and everyone's trying to pretend they're working for the greater good while secretly planning their next move. So what did they actually do? First, Germany. Or, well, something kind of like Germany. Instead of unifying the countless tiny German states, they created the German Confederation, a loose cluster of 39 states with no real central power. It looked unified from far away, but up close? Total chaos. Imagine trying to herd cats, but each cat has its own flag and anthem. Then there's Italy. If the German situation was a mess, Italy was the discount clearance bin of the European puzzle. The north was dominated by Austria. The center had the Pope doing his thing. The south was ruled by the Bourbons. And Venetians? Still reminiscing about the old glory days. It was less a country, more a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces and 3 people fighting over how to finish it. Poland? Oh, poor Poland. It was turned into a constitutional kingdom, which sounds nice on paper, but was ruled by the Russian Tsar. Picture giving someone a toy steering wheel and telling them they're driving. Yeah, that kind of autonomy. And even France, defeated France, somehow walked away from the whole thing still sitting at the big kids' table. They lost the war, but not their seat at the top. That's diplomacy, baby. The new European map looked clean, symmetrical, and oh so organized. But it was built like a Jenga tower, perfectly stacked on the surface, dangerously unstable underneath. They didn't ask people what they wanted. They just assumed that if the borders looked neat, the continent would stay quiet. Spoiler, it didn't. Because while the diplomats were drawing lines, the ideas, those pesky little things like liberty, nationalism, and revolution, were still simmering just under the surface, waiting for their moment. And that's where we go next, the fake peace that looked calm on the outside, but was gagging anyone who dared to speak out. On paper, the Congress of Vienna gave Europe peace. But it was a very particular kind of peace, the type you get when everyone's too afraid to speak. Not real harmony, just strategic silence. Enter Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian diplomat who basically became the spiritual CEO of post-Napoleonic Europe. His job? Make sure that all those rebellious ideas, liberalism, nationalism, democracy, got shoved back into Pandora's box, locked, double-taped, and thrown into the Danube. The solution? A continent-wide gag order. Metternich and his allies built what you might call the Status Quo Protection Squad. They put strict censorship laws in place. Universities were watched like suspect group chats. Secret police monitored intellectual circles. Publishing a political pamphlet could get you exiled, or worse, silenced permanently. Think less. Free exchange of ideas. More equilibrium meets The Handmaid's Tale, where any whiff of rebellion was treated like a virus. And just to make sure no country got funny ideas, they came up with the Congress system, regular meetings between the great powers to keep everyone in line. Basically, the first ever group chat of Europe's top dogs, but with more uniforms and fewer memes. If someone somewhere started a revolution, bam, international intervention. Shut it down. Fast. It's like when that one family member tries to talk politics in the WhatsApp group and suddenly everyone's pretending to share recipes, just to avoid the explosion. Except here, the recipes were armies, and the explosions were, well, literal. So yes, Europe was quiet. On the surface. But this wasn't peace born of unity. It was peace enforced by paranoia. The monarchs feared their own people more than foreign armies. And you know what happens when you bottle up ideas? They ferment. They evolve. And eventually, they break through with even more force. Because the next generation wasn't content to whisper their ideals in the dark. Especially not in Italy or Germany, places that had been chopped into pieces, micromanaged, and told to stay in their corners. And that's exactly where we're headed next, to the broken nations dreaming of unity, and how the Peace of Vienna only made their hunger stronger. You can only keep the lid on a boiling pot for so long. While Metternich and his clique were busy playing ideological whack-a-mole across Europe, two regions in particular were not having it, Italy and Germany. Vienna had tried to keep them chopped up and obedient, but the more they were divided, the more they dreamed of being whole. Let's start with Italy. Under the elegant chandeliers of the Congress, Austria claimed the north of the Italian peninsula like someone calling dibs on the best slice of cake. But to the Italians? Austria wasn't a guardian of peace, it was an unwanted babysitter who never left. The idea of a unified Italy started to catch fire in secret societies, poetry circles, and student gatherings. It wasn't just about politics, it was romantic, cultural, emotional. Il Risorgimento was born, a word that literally means rebirth. And when your national identity becomes a poetic cause, that's when things start getting dangerous for empires. Germany wasn't much different. The German Confederation looked like unity from a distance, but inside it was just a messy roommate arrangement between dozens of princes who couldn't agree on how to decorate the kitchen. But something else was bubbling, the Industrial Revolution. Cities like Berlin and Frankfurt were growing. Trains were moving. Money was flowing. And with that came a new, educated middle class, the kind of people who read books, demanded constitutions, and didn't appreciate being treated like peasants. Add to that the rise of German romantic nationalism, the idea that a shared language, culture, and mythology should mean one unified nation, and suddenly, Metternich's Jenga tower started wobbling. The revolutions of 1830 were just the warm-up. By 1848, the whole system was shaking. Because trying to keep Italy and Germany fragmented was like trying to keep 7 exes in a group vacation without drama, doomed from the start. And that brings us to the breaking point. The year when Europe, all at once, said enough. Because the pressure wasn't just building in the idealists or the poets, it was building everywhere. And when 1848 hit, the entire continent lit up. Hey, Discovers, real quick before we dive back in, I've got a small favor to ask. If you're the kind of person who loves a good story, the real ones, with epic battles, wild mysteries, unforgettable characters, and lessons that still echo today, then this channel is for you. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore history in a way that's curious, smart, and surprisingly fun. Because understanding the past has never been this interesting. So, Europe was a ticking time bomb. Inside, the ideas of unity and freedom were heating up. But while the great powers were obsessed with keeping the internal pressure under control, they forgot to look beyond their castle walls. Because while the Congress of Vienna was busy redrawing lines and silencing revolutions, the rest of the world was, quite literally, on fire. Let's start with Latin America. Between 1810 and 1830, wave after wave of independence movements swept across the continent. Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, all breaking away from Spain and Portugal. Entire empires were crumbling overseas. And how much attention did Vienna give to this massive geopolitical shift? Basically none. For the diplomats sipping champagne in Austria, Latin America was just background noise. An annoying bug during a symphony. And then there's Africa and Asia, where Europe wasn't defending against ideas, it was planting flags. The seeds of colonialism were already being sown during the Congress era, with little to no discussion, oversight, or international concern. It was like deciding how to remodel your kitchen while your backyard was being taken over by strangers. Even the topic of slavery, which was raised by British delegate Castlereagh, barely made a dent. Sure, there were some polite nods toward abolition. But the political will? Non-existent. It's as if they wanted to look moral without actually committing to anything inconvenient. In short, while Europe was desperately trying to preserve a fragile peace at home, it was ignoring the chaos and opportunities exploding everywhere else. And here's the irony. The very system that ignored the world outside was also rotting from within. Because if 1830 and 1840 were tremors, 1848 was the full-blown earthquake. The moment when every crack they painted over burst wide open. The year the continent stopped pretending and started fighting back. Imagine trying to hold a beach ball underwater for 30 years. That was Europe in 1848. And eventually, it exploded right back in your face. This was the year the system cracked. Not slowly. Not gently. All at once. In February, France, the same France that had been reintegrated so nicely into the European Power Club, suddenly booted its monarchy again and declared a new republic. The barricades went up in Paris, the streets filled with chants, and the crown was tossed like a bad tinder match. Metternich must have felt the earthquake all the way in Vienna, and not just metaphorically. Because it didn't stop there. In Germany, the patchwork of princely states saw mass demonstrations and uprisings demanding, get this, actual representation, constitutions, and maybe, just maybe, a real German nation. Frankfurt even hosted a national assembly. It was messy, idealistic, and way too democratic for the old guard. But it was a sign, people weren't whispering anymore. Meanwhile, in Italy, revolutionaries took up arms in Milan, Venice, and Rome. The Pope fled. Austrian garrisons were attacked. Nationalist leaders like Mazzini and Garibaldi saw their chance to turn the fragmented peninsula into one Italy. Spoiler, it didn't stick yet. But the dream was out of the bottle. And Austria itself? The heart of the old order? Vienna rose up. Workers, students, even parts of the army took to the streets. Metternich, the man who symbolized the system, had to flee. By carriage. In disguise. Like the villain in a season finale of The Crown. It was like Hearts of Iron 4 when you ignore rising tensions for too long and suddenly half the map turns red, and the other half starts blinking with civil unrest. The so-called Peace of Vienna had turned brittle. All it took was one hard year to break it. And even though many of these revolutions were ultimately crushed, the message was clear. The old system was out of time, out of touch, and out of tools. But Vienna's ghost wasn't gone yet. It lingered, especially in the tangled web of alliances, resentments, and power plays that would define the late 19th century. Because the end of this story isn't 1848. It's 1914. The revolutions may have died down, but the fault lines were still there, deeper, sharper, more dangerous. The Congress of Vienna had promised long-term peace, but what it really built was a giant powder keg, with a really long fuse. Let's talk legacy. After 1848, Europe didn't exactly collapse, it mutated. The kings and emperors clung to power, but the world around them kept shifting. And those neat little borders drawn in 1815? They aged like unrefrigerated milk. Take Alsace-Lorraine, for example, a French-speaking region that got yanked into the newly unified German Empire in 1871. France never forgot. The bitterness festered like an old wound, and by the 20th century, it was basically a tattoo that read, "To be avenged." Or look at the Balkans, a beautiful, volatile mess where the Ottoman Empire was crumbling, Russia was meddling, Austria-Hungary was panicking, and every small nation wanted a piece of the pie. It was like Succession, but with more rifles and national anthems. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary itself had become a Frankenstein empire. A patchwork of ethnicities, religions, and grudges held together by inertia and bureaucracy. It was a ticking time bomb held together with imperial duct tape. And then there's Germany, once a confederation, now a powerhouse. When Prussia finally unified the German states under Bismarck, it didn't just shift the balance, it broke it. Suddenly, there was a new big dog in town. And the rest of Europe started sweating. The so-called Concert of Europe, that gentleman's club of powers working together since Vienna, slowly gave way to something much more fragile: alliances, defensive pacts, secret treaties. Everyone making friends just in case the next war came knocking. It was no longer about keeping peace. It was about preparing for collapse. Just like in The Godfather, everything seemed calm on the surface. Handshakes, dinners, ceremonies, until that moment when someone gets shot at the toll booth and you realize peace was just a cover for the next betrayal. The Congress of Vienna built a magnificent diplomatic mansion, but it never reinforced the foundations. And in 1914, the whole structure came crashing down. So, was the Congress of Vienna a success? In the short term? Absolutely. It stopped the bleeding after the Napoleonic Wars, got the monarchs back on their thrones, and gave Europe a few decades of relative peace. Everyone at the table toasted their achievements, went home with titles and promotions, and patted themselves on the back for a job well done. But long term? It was a spectacular failure in slow motion. The Congress prioritized order over change, silence over dialogue, and stability over justice. It redrew the map with straight lines and blindfolds, ignoring the people living underneath those borders, people with languages, cultures, dreams, and increasingly, rage. And that's the heart of the issue. It wasn't the Congress itself that doomed Europe. It was the silence it enforced. The fear of ideas. The refusal to adapt. The belief that if you lock the door and throw away the key, the world outside will just behave. It didn't. Every conflict that erupted over the next 100 years, from the revolutions of 1848, to the scramble for colonies, to the nationalist fervor that fueled World War I, was born, in some way, from the tensions Vienna tried to bury. The peace of 1815 didn't prevent war. It postponed it. And when that war finally came, in 1914, it wasn't a minor scuffle. It was a continent-wide, industrialized bloodbath, the exact nightmare Vienna tried to avoid. So here's the final image. A map of Europe in 1815, full of empires, crowned heads, and clean lines. Then a map of 1914, with alliances like spiderwebs, tension like a coiled spring. And then, a map of today, still shaped by decisions made in that golden hall in Vienna, where 5 men with quills believed they could control history. Turns out, they just delayed it.